Hi, this is the second part of the pinching demo where I talk about doing a composite pinch. So a composite pinch is nothing more than 2 or 3 pinch pots put together. And the dangers and sort of the challenge of this project is basically how well can you join the pieces and how well can you hold the piece up while you're making a more complex form. So right here I have a finished pot, it's a fired pot, and this was just a composite pinch pot that's made of actually 3 separate pinch pots. There's a bottom pot, a top, and then this little neck of this bottle. So what we're gonna try to do is make something that's kind of similar to this with terracotta today. So what I've done is I've started with a pinch pot that's already roughed out, and you can see by the rim right here that it's about 1/4 of an inch thick. And this is actually important because I'm going to be putting 2 pots together like this. So I need to have the surface area wide enough so it's easy for pots for the clay to adhere. So in this particular project or part of the module, you're creating a composite pinch pot that's based on a botanical form in some way. And that reference to botanical forms could be in the form itself, the shape, it could be in the surface decoration, it could also be in the surface texture. So those are the 3 ways you can sort of reference it. And this can be kind of abstract. It actually doesn't have to be a plant. I mean, it can just reference plant-like things. So I've got this started, and I've got another one that's sort of roughed out. And you can see right here, that's a little bit smaller. And what I'm gonna try to do is make these 2 halves match. So I'm gonna go ahead and stretch this out a little bit. You don't want the clay to be too thin or too wet in this process, but because the clay is soft, and I'm actually going to be building a complex form that's one piece on top of another, I'm going to have to use something called an armature to hold it up. And armatures can be many things. It can be something that's rigid like wood or wire. It could be something that's a little softer like paper. But in the case of this particular piece, I'm actually going to use air as my armature. I'm going to put these 2 pieces together, then blow them up with a little bit of air, which will hold the piece up so I can build on top of it. Now the danger with air as an armature is you cannot leave air in an enclosed space in clay, because what will happen when you fire the piece, it will blow up. And that's because no matter how dry clay is, there's always water in it, and in some cases the water is chemical. But the actual water usually boils at about 220 degrees Fahrenheit. And while you're going through that process of the firing itself, in terms of the first part of the kiln firing, that's when pieces can literally blow up in the kiln, and they can take all of your classmates' work with them. So you have to be very careful with that. So I've got these 2 pieces, and I'm gonna go ahead and check it, and you can see that the diameter is pretty good. It's a little bit smaller. I'll give it a couple little squeezes, and then I'll go ahead and put it together one more time. So that looks pretty good. And I'll just check to see the best way that it matches. And when I get a pretty good matchup, what I'm gonna do is just take my needle tool and make a mark. This is just to key it, so it's easier for me to put it together in just a few minutes. So I've got these 2 pieces of clay together, and my point is to make a seamless, airtight join between these 2 pieces of clay. So one of the things about joining clay that's really important, clay has to be a consistent moisture content when you're going to join 2 pieces together. In other words, these have to have the same moisture content. I could not join a dry piece to a wet piece because of the issues of shrinkage. So as clay dries, it shrinks because it evaporates, water is evaporated out of the clay itself. So as it starts to shrink, if I were to put a dry piece of clay on a wet piece of clay, the dry clay would be already shrinking. The wet clay then has to shrink, and as those 2 shrinkage rates change, actually this seam will split. So this is a really important concept as you're building forward in clay. So I'm going to take these 2 pieces, and in order to join them, I'm going to have to use a rib, and this is a serrated rib. It's a scoring rib, and basically what it's going to do is create a textured surface. And this textured surface gives the clay a chance to grab hold of each itself. It's almost like putting a Velcro on the two clay parts. So I know it's really important to make these two joins be very strong. And whenever you're joining clay, there's always the potential of weakness. So I'm going to score both of these surfaces really well. And then in order to get these to stick together, I need something that's kind of like a glue. So I'm going to use slip liquid clay. You can also use water, but in this particular case, I've just got a little bit of slip mixed up. And all it is a little bit of this clay body mixed with some water. And I'm taking a brush and I'm just going to dab a little bit of it on. And you can see it's not a lot, it's just a little. And this is going to serve as the glue that actually glues these two pieces together. So that's slipped. I only have to slip one side. And I'm going to pick this up and I'm going to look for my key marks. And I'm going to line those key marks up. And I'm going to carefully align these two halves and sort of shake them back and forth to make sure that they're actually making a connection. Sometimes the clay slides around a little bit because it's very wet, but you just have to just do an adjustment. So there I've got that adjusted. Now, this seam has to be airtight, and it's not airtight in this case. So I'm going to pick up my wooden tool, and I'm going to go ahead and pull these two halves together. So I'm just going to pull this. And you can work pretty quickly. This tool actually really helps. It's a lot more accurate than using your fingers. You can see the clay is quite wet, and I'm holding it gingerly. I'm not putting a lot of pressure on it because I don't want to crush it. So I'm going to go ahead and join these. Now this is a demonstration, so I'm trying to go quickly, but you could spend a little more time with this. I'm going to pull the clay that way. So while these are joined, this is not actually a really strong joint at this point. I'm going to carefully put this down because it wants to collapse on itself. And I'm going to grab a little piece of clay and actually make a worm. So in this particular piece, I'll just move this out of the way. I'm just going to use a little piece of clay like this, squeeze it out, and I'm going to roll it back and forth with my fingers. Now, there is a technique with rolling a coil. You want to start in the middle and move your hand out toward either side. And you can see how I'm rolling it back and forth. And I start in the middle again and roll it this way. And I go back. And I want this coil to be actually kind of thin. I don't want to add a lot of bulky clay to the middle of this piece. So I'm going to go roll this out. I think that's long enough to go around the circumference of this little two-piece composite pot. And I could attach it just like this, but I'm going to go ahead and reduce the bulk a little bit more and just use this little pony roller and just sort of roll it out a little flat. Now, remembering, of course, our joining, you always have to score a piece of clay when you're going to join it and then add a little slip. So I'm going to go ahead and score this coil, this joining coil, and make sure it's on there, it's scored pretty well. And then I'm going to gingerly pick this up and go ahead and score this surface too. So in this particular piece, I'm going to kind of work fast. So this demo, I'm going to show you how to put these two pieces together and blow them up and hopefully create a kind of almost finished piece. I'm not going to really finish a piece because it's going to take too long. I'll just get it started and then show you what it looks like later. So I have these two pieces. Now remember, the second part of joining clay is actually scoring and then slipping or adding water. And so I'm just going to go ahead and add a little bit of clay slip to this coil. And I'm just going to pick it up and then lay it down. So as the clay is laid down on the surface, I'm actually going to take my finger and sort of stretch the clay out, thinning it a little bit more and pressing it with my thumb to make sure it makes a good contact with the surface. And this is kind of like the patch that's going to allow these two seams to come together. And then I've got this piece of clay and I'm going to pick up this wooden tool again and pull the coil into each piece. So this particular pot that I showed you just a few minutes ago, I'll just set it over here. You can see that it's rather refined by comparison to this rough piece. And the refining process actually comes after you add air into the surface of the clay. So I'm going to pull these together because I really want this seam to be airtight. just work my way around as quickly as possible. And you can see I pretty much joined that together. So that's a rough area that needs to be refined, obviously, but now I'm going to blow it up with the air. And I think what I'm going to do is sort of orient the pot so the smaller end is at the bottom. So this more or less like this. And so I'm going to set this down like that. And what I'm going to do is get ready to add a little bit of air. So in order to get air into the middle of this, you've got to have a mouthpiece. So I'm just going to roll a little mouthpiece that looks like a Hershey's Kiss, just like this, and I'm just going to attach it onto the top of the clay. Now, attaching is important. You want to make sure that it's fairly airtight. And I'm going to use this mouthpiece and actually put a little hole in it so I can actually get air into the interior. Now, once that hole is in there, I'm going to blow it up, and then I'm going to take my lips and pinch it off. The clay is non-toxic, so you don't have to worry about it. It just looks a little odd on your mouth. So I'm going to ream this hole out. I've got a pretty good sized hole. You can see it right here. And then I'm going to go ahead and puff air into that lightly and then take my lips and pinch it off. So I pinched it. You can see this clay. Now I want to get rid of not only the clay on my mouth, but this extra clay. So I'm going to actually just pinch it a couple of different ways just to get this clay off and make sure that that hole stays covered. And then I can smooth this out. At this point, I've got this great building module. I can use these modules and stack them one on top of the other and make a fairly complex form. But always the issue with this is to remember that this is an enclosed airspace at this point, and I cannot fire it like this. There always has to be a way for the steam when it's being fired to actually have an area to come out of. But that will be the last sort of process to this. Now I'm going to pick up this piece of wood. It's called a paddle, and the paddle is really great because it allows you to not only compress the surface, but shape the piece. And you can see how it starts to refine this form. It gets a little bit more smooth and not quite as rough looking. And really my object at this point is to smooth that seam so it's actually not visible anymore to the naked eye. You can see one more time that I'm not using a lot of water. Just like the symmetrical pinch pot, you do not need to add water to the surface of this to smooth it. All you have to do is actually compress. So this paddle does one stage of compressing and shaping to a certain extent. And you just keep working it around. And I'm holding this rather delicately because this clay is still quite soft. Even though it has air in it, the clay itself is really pretty wet. And then I can just use my silicone rib, which is a really good way of smoothing the surface. Now at this point, I have a really a good beginning of a basic form that I can modify and create a myriad of different kind of pieces with. I mean, I could make this sculptural. I could like tie this to a vessel, which I'm going to do with this sort of bottle form. You can pretty much go anywhere with it. That's your big challenge, actually, is to complete this project and complete this symmetrical or this composite form and to make something that has a botanical theme. Now, remember, this is just 2 pinch pots put together, but you have to have 3 or more in your composite piece that you turn in for your midterm grade. And so that's sort of the basic premise of this. I'm going to set this down, move this out of the way. I'm going to move this out. And I'm going to show you one more thing. I haven't really actually worked on this too much. I'm just going to let this set up. But I do need to make a bottleneck for this. So what I've done is I've started with a piece of clay that I'm actually going to hollow out. Now I'm wondering where where my rod is. This will work as a chopstick. So what I've got is a graduated cylinder like this, and it's a little bit, you can see that the proportions are not that bad actually. I'll probably modify this a little bit, but it's a little rough on this end. So I want to cut this off and sort of shorten it. And so what I'm going to do is pick up my fettling knife, and I'm just going to roll this. If I were to cut flat through this rounded graduated solid cylinder of clay that I made just by rolling it back and forth on my work table will be crushed. So what I'm going to do is actually roll it and score a line. You can see it's scored all the way around. And then I just take this little bit of clay and twist, and it comes off. And it doesn't distort the shape that much. So I have that sort of worked out. And now I'm going to take this chopstick and actually use it to hollow out this form so I can actually have a bottle. What I'm going to do is just holding it by the narrow end, take my chopstick and literally just push it in. As I'm pushing it in, I'm also spinning it. And I try to eyeball it down the center of this as much as possible, and you'll see it come out this other end, hopefully on the center, and there it comes right there. And in order to open this up, I can just roll it on this. So what I do is I just hold the chopstick end, and I put a little bit of pressure on this side to open this bottom part up. And you can sort of see how that opens. And I start to have this sort of graduated neck for a bottle. And I mean, this bottleneck could be a number of different things. It could be a spout, the beginning of a spout, but I'm just gonna use this as a bottle. So I'm gonna go ahead and pinch this top lip to kind of round that off, make it a little more organic. And I'm also gonna go down and modify the bottom of this a little bit. To start spreading it out. Now, when you're making complex forms like this, this will probably take about an hour to complete, which I'm not going to really go through. What I'll do is I'll complete this after I turn the video off and then show you a picture of the finished piece. But what I do is I make the parts or the components. In this case is going to be the beginning of the bottleneck, and you can start seeing that the modification of the shape is actually giving it a little bit more individuality. Let's see if I can move this more in front of me. And I usually make these components and just let them set up. One of the critical methodologies of working with complex forms is making clay components and then assembling them when they get dry enough to hold themselves up. While this has air in it, and it's a little more rigid than it would have been without the air, so that's the armature that's kind of holding this up. This part of the component is actually quite wet, and I'll want to flare that out just a bit more. And it's nice working on a turntable where you can get the clay a little bit more to eye level and really see what you're doing. This terracotta that I'm working with has a tendency to stay relatively soft and relatively wet for a long time. I'm just learning how to use this clay. Normally I work in a white stoneware and I would fire my pieces, but with COVID, it's really difficult to get my wood firing crew together, so I'm just playing around with terracotta. Now I know this neck is a little bit too long in terms of the composition of this, so I'll probably shorten it later. In order to get the texture that I have in here on this particular neck, you can see it's like a flower that's upside down. I generally just use the tools that I have on hand to make impressions. So I've got this, just this simple wooden tool. I'll wet it. And what I do is I start by just drawing down the surface and turning it. And these lines just become the lines that give me a chance to modify this. And then between the lines, actually just like the regular pinch pot, I can just pull this out. You can see I'm just pressing this and stretching the clay. And I start modifying this quite a bit. I'll flare this out. So these pots are actually really kind of a lot of fun to work on. They're complex. You can spend hours on them, modifying them. The things that I'm really looking for in your particular projects are really good join marks, a good sense of proportion, a sense of craft. You need to be really careful with the techniques themselves. Try your hardest. Sometimes making some sketches ahead of time will help you create a roadmap for your piece itself, how it's going to finish. Obviously, I've made a lot of these, and so I have a kind of a good idea of where I'm going with it. But they all started with these like initial sketches. So I hope this helps you out. Now, one other tip. I will probably join this neck part to the bottle once I refine this bottle after this gets a little bit more set up. And once this is set up where it's not squishy, and you can see it's pretty soft and squishy at this point, I can cut the opening for this bottleneck in the main body and then attach this on top. So that's what I'll do. Thanks a lot. I hope this helps you out this week. Remember that your composite pieces in process, take an image of them, put them in the Dropbox, just so you can get an idea of how the Dropbox works and how to post images. If you have any trouble, just come back to class next week and I'll be able to help you out with that. But I hope this helps you out this week. I hope you have fun with this and just play around, just have some good time. So I'll see you next week. Thanks.